Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Mia felt the sharp jolt as the starship's hull gave way to the explosion. Her hands gripped the control panel as the entire ship trembled beneath her, a low hum of warning sirens echoing in her ears. She cursed under her breath, not for the first time, as the alien fighters pursued her relentlessly through the starfield. The Starchild were supposed to be the elite of the galaxy, but even they had weaknesses when outnumbered and outgunned. Systems failure imminent. Prepare for crash landing. The ship's eye chimed in, as cold and emotionless as always. Mia's jaw tightened. The dense atmosphere of the blue planet below was fast approaching, her ship breaking through its exosphere with rapid descent. She adjusted the angle of her landing manually, her body braced for impact. There was no time to contact her people, no way to signal for help. The enemy had scrambled her communications as soon as they locked onto her. All she could do was trust in her own skills. The ship careened through the sky, a glowing trail of debris and smoke in its wake as it plummeted toward the surface. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as the ground loomed closer, trees and mountains rushing toward her at a terrifying speed. Just before the inevitable crash, she sealed her helmet and braced for impact. The ship slammed into the ground with a deafening crash. Metal groaned and twisted under the force, trees splintered, and dirt exploded into the air, burying the craft in a deep trench. Mia was thrown forward, her body rattled violently within the cockpit as her harness struggled to keep her in place. Then, everything went black. Tom heard the explosion first, a dull roar in the distance that rumbled through the ground beneath his feet. His eyes narrowed as he stood in the open doorway of his small, secluded cabin, tucked deep in the woods. The sound was unusual. Unlike the typical thunder of a summer storm, it was sharper, more forceful. A crash, perhaps. His instincts flared. He stepped out onto the porch, his worn boots creaking on the wooden boards as he scanned the horizon. Thick smoke rose above the tree line, far off but visible even from here. Something had come down hard, something big. His muscles tensed with a familiar readiness he hadn't felt in years. There was an urge in him, a pull, the same instinct that had kept him alive in battle. Tom ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, considering his options. He had left the world of conflict behind, seeking peace out here in the quiet. But whatever had fallen from the sky was close enough to his territory that it could pose a threat. He couldn't ignore it. He moved back into the cabin, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, and threw on his jacket. The weight of the gun in his hands was a strange comfort, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. Slinging a backpack over his shoulder with supplies, Tom headed toward the source of the smoke, weaving through the thick underbrush and across the rocky terrain. The closer he got, the more apparent it became that this wasn't any normal crash. Trees had been knocked down in a wide radius, the ground scorched and torn as if something huge had been dragged across it. And there, in the center of the devastation, was a massive, twisted hunk of metal, what remained of a ship, unlike anything Tom had ever seen. His breath caught in his throat. Tom paused at the edge of the crash site, his rifle held tightly in his hands. He scanned the wreckage carefully, taking in the sight of the crumpled hull, the alien markings etched into the metal. This wasn't a satellite or a piece of space junk. This was something else, something alive. He approached slowly, his boots scrunching over broken branches and charred debris. A low hiss escaped the wreckage, and Tom stopped in his tracks. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his gun raised, ready for whatever might come next. He could feel the heat emanating from the ship, the acrid smell of burnt metal thick in the air. And then, with a creak of metal, something moved. Out of the wreckage crawled a figure, humanoid but unmistakably alien. It was a woman, tall, strong, her body encased in sleek armor that shimmered with a faint blue light. Her face was covered by a helmet, her movements sluggish, as if the crash had taken everything out of her. She collapsed to her knees, breathing hard. Tom hesitated. His first instinct was to protect himself, to keep his distance from this alien stranger. But something about the way she struggled to stand, the way she clutched her side as if she was hurt, made him pause. He lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes locked on her. "Hey!" he called out, his voice rough and wary. "Are you okay?" The figure turned her head toward him slowly. Her helmet flickered, then with a soft hiss, it retracted, revealing her face. She was striking her skin a soft silver hue, her eyes glowing faintly with a pale, almost ethereal light. But there was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion. She spoke in a language he didn't understand, her voice melodic yet strained. Tom took a cautious step forward, his rifle still half raised. "I don't know what you're saying, lady, but you look like you need help." She winced, placing a hand on her side where a deep gash ran along her armor, leaking a glowing liquid that Tom could only assume was blood. She nodded slowly, understanding his tone even if she didn't know the words. Tom moved closer, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He pulled a first aid kit from his pack, then knelt beside her, hesitating for a moment. He had never patched up an alien before. "I'll try not to hurt you," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She watched him intently as he worked, her breathing shallow but steady. As Tom bandaged the wound, she studied his face, her eyes filled with something that resembled curiosity. There was a quiet understanding between them, despite the lack of shared language. Once he had done all he could for the wound, Tom sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're not from around here, huh?" he said dryly. The woman Mia, as Tom would later learn her name, shook her head slightly. She pointed up toward the sky, her hand trembling with effort. Tom followed her gaze, understanding what she meant. Wherever she was from, it was far from here. Over the next few days, Mia recovered slowly, her strength returning bit by bit. Tom had taken her back to his cabin, not knowing what else to do. He wasn't sure if he should have contacted someone, the authorities maybe, but a part of him knew they wouldn't believe him anyway. Besides, he had no desire to bring the outside world into his life, and not after everything he had gone through to escape it. Mia didn't speak much, and when she did, it was in her own language, which still sounded like music to Tom's ears. But they communicated in other ways. She showed him things in her armor, her weapons, bits of technology that fascinated Tom but made him feel woefully outmatched by the vastness of the universe. And Mia, in turn, seemed fascinated by the simplicity of his life. She watched him repair old machines, studied the way he moved through the forest as if it was his domain. One evening, as the sun set and cast a warm glow over the clearing, Mia stepped outside, her arm finally free from the makeshift sling Tom had fashioned for her. She stood by the edge of the porch, looking up at the stars with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. "They're out there, huh?" he said quietly, joining her at the railing. "Your people?" Mia glanced at him, her glowing eyes softening. She nodded, pointing again to the sky, then to herself. "They're coming for you?" She nodded again, more slowly this time. There was something in her expression, a hesitation, maybe even fear. It was strange to see on someone who seemed so strong, so unbreakable. Tom leaned on the railing, watching her closely. "You don't want to go back, do you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Mia didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared up at the sky, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, after a long moment, she shook her head, the motion small but unmistakable. Tom exhaled slowly, glancing up at the stars with her. "I get it," he said quietly. "I didn't want to go back either." That was when the first attack came. The night was still, the forest quiet around them. Tom had just settled in for the evening, his rifle leaning against the wall next to the door, when a strange humming sound filled the air. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tom's eyes snapped open, his muscles instantly tense. Mia was already on her feet, her expression hardening into the mask of a warrior. She rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness, her body rigid with tension. Tom grabbed his rifle, moving to her side. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Mia pointed into the distance, her eyes narrowing. A faint light flickered through the trees, moving quickly toward them. It wasn't human. Tom's grip tightened on the rifle, his heart thudding in his chest as the faint light drew nearer. Mia moved swiftly, a silent shadow, her body poised for battle. She motioned for Tom to follow, her glowing eyes scanning the trees with practiced precision. Tom knew enough to trust her instincts. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. The hum grew louder, and soon Tom could see the shapes moving through the tressa dark, fast, and clearly not of this world. Mia raised her hand, a signal for him to stay low. She crouched, and with a flick of her wrist, her armor emitted a soft, nearly invisible glow, activating some kind of defensive shield. Tom wasn't sure what kind of tech she was using, but he was glad to have her on his side. He knelt beside her, rifle ready, as the figures drew closer. Now he could make out more details. Tall, insectoid creatures with segmented limbs and metallic carapaces. Their eyes glowed a sickly green, and they moved with a fluid, unnatural speed, skimming just above the ground like they were hovering. Mia tensed, her hand gripping the hilt of a blade that Tom hadn't noticed before. She waited, her body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. Tom held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The creatures stopped just at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes locking onto the cabin. One of them let out a low, clicking sound that made Tom's skin crawl. He glanced at Mia, waiting for her cue. She didn't move, her eyes fixed on the creatures, calculating. Tom could see the tension in her muscles, the readiness in her stance. Then, without warning, one of the creatures lunged forward, its long limbs slicing through the air with a deadly precision. Mia was faster. In a blur of movement, she leapt into action, her blade slicing through the air with a sound so sharp it was almost musical. The creature's head rolled clean off its body before it even had a chance to strike. Tom fired his rifle, hitting another one square inches the chest. It let out a high-pitched screech as it collapsed to the ground, twitching violently before going still. But there were more. The remaining creatures surged forward, their numbers greater than Tom had anticipated. Mia was a whirlwind of motion, her blade flashing as she cut down one after another with lethal efficiency. Tom backed her up, firing at anything that got too close. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the metallic screeches of the alien attackers. One of the creatures managed to slip past Mia's defenses, lunging at Tom with razor-sharp limbs. He barely had time to react, rolling out of the way just as its claws slashed the air where he had been standing. He fired a shot, but the creature was fast, dodging with unnatural agility. Before Tom could fire again, Mia was there, her blade driving deep into the creature's chest. It let out a final, gurgling screech before collapsing at her feet. She pulled the blade free, her glowing eyes meeting Tom's for a brief second, just long enough to share a wordless understanding. They were in this together. The last of the creatures fell with a sickening crunch as Mia drove her blade into its skull, the sound echoing through the clearing. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun, but Tom could feel the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He stood slowly, his muscles tense, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Mia wiped her blade on the grass, her movements calm and methodical, as if this was just another day at the office for her. Tom watched her, a strange mix of awe and disbelief settling in his chest. She was unlike Enya or anything he had ever seen. They weren't here by accident, were they? Tom asked, his voice rough from the fight. Mia shook her head, her expression grim. She pointed to the sky, then back to the fallen creatures, her meaning clear. They had been sent here, likely tracking the signal from her crashed ship. And if these were just scouts, there could be more coming. Tom cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. So what now? Do we wait for more of them to show up? Mia looked at him for a long moment, then motioned toward the cabin. She made a gesture that Tom took to mean prepare. He nodded, understanding that they couldn't afford to sit around and wait for the next wave. He wasn't sure how many more of these things might be out there, but he knew one thing: they'd be coming. He and Mia needed a plan, fast. Inside the cabin, Tom gathered what supplies he had: extra ammo, some rudimentary explosives he rigged up for emergencies, and whatever else might come in handy. Mia, meanwhile, examined a small device that she had salvaged from the wreckage of her ship. Tom couldn't make heads or tails of it, but Mia seemed to think it could help. He watched her as she worked, her hands moving with quick precision over the alien tech. She looked focused, but there was something else in her expression too, something darker, more conflicted. Tom didn't know much about her, but he had seen enough to know that whatever choice she was facing, it wasn't an easy one. "They'll come for you, won't they?" Tom asked quietly. Mia paused, her hand stilling for a moment before she nodded. "Your people." Another nod, slower this time. Tom exhaled, leaning back against the wall. "And you don't want to go back?" Mia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the device in her hands, her brow furrowing as if she was deep in thought. Then, she shook her head, the movement barely perceptible but enough for Tom to understand. "I get it," Tom said softly. "I didn't want to go back either. After the war a broken bar I couldn't. It's why I'm out here, away from all of it." Mia looked up at him, her glowing eyes meeting his. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but undeniable. They were both soldiers, both haunted by their pasts, both searching for something beyond the battlefield. Tom sighed, pushing himself off the wall and walking over to her. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen when your people get here, but whatever you decide, I'll back you up. You've got my word." Mia's eyes softened, and for the first time since they met, she smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but a smile nonetheless. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of gratitude that didn't need words. The moment was interrupted by a sudden beeping from the device in Mia's hand. Her expression shifted instantly, her body tensing as she examined the readings. Tom watched her carefully, his gut telling him that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. Mia turned to him, her face set in a grim line. She pointed to the sky, then back to the device, and made a gesture that Tom recognized as one word: "Now." "They're coming," Tom said, his heart sinking. "And soon." Mia nodded, already moving toward the door. Tom grabbed his rifle, his mind racing as they stepped outside. The sky above them was dark, the stars twinkling faintly overhead, but there was something else there now, something new. A low, distant rumble echoed through the air, growing louder by the second. Tom looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Far above them, just barely visible against the night sky, was the unmistakable silhouette of a massive sheep, or star-kiled. By the looks of it, it hovered high in the atmosphere, casting a faint glow over the landscape below. "They found you," Tom muttered, his grip tightening on the rifle. Mia's face was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the ship above. She stood there for a long moment, as if weighing her options, before she turned to Tom. She pointed to the cabin, then to him, and made a gesture that he didn't need to translate. "Stay here." "No way," Tom said firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Mia shook her head, her expression hardening. She pointed to the cabin again, more insistently this time, but Tom wasn't backing down. "Listen," he said, stepping closer to her. "I get that you're trying to protect me or whatever, but we've been through too much together for me to just sit this one out. I'm with you, no matter what happens." Mia's eyes softened for a brief moment, and Tom thought he saw something like appreciation there. But before she could respond, a sudden burst of light filled the sky above them, followed by a deafening roar. The star-kiled ship had fired its engines, descending rapidly toward the surface. There was no time left to argue. Tom turned to Mia, his jaw set. "Whatever we're doing it now." She nodded, her face a mask of determination, and together they prepared to face what was coming next, to an uncertain future, a battle for survival, and a decision that would change everything.